Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online for tonight's event with C Pam Zhang and Karen Chee, celebrating the paperback launch of How Much of These Hills is Gold? My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the Programs Manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. Please let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I'm speaking to you all from Brooklyn, New York, which is on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. At a time when our communities are specifically vulnerable, we continue to offer a space in which we can imagine a more just future. You can visit aaw.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We have time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour. You can ask your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or in the chat if you're watching on YouTube. Books are for sale thanks to our friends at Books Are Magic. You can find a link to purchase in the chat, and you can support an independent bookstore in doing so. I am going to briefly introduce Pam and Karen, and then I hope you'll join me in welcoming Pam on screen to read. Born in Beijing, C Pam Zhang is mostly an artifact of the United States. She is the author of How Much of These Hills is Gold, winner of the Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award and the Asian Pacific Award for Literature, nominated for the Booker Prize and a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award and the Lambda Literary Award. Zhang's writing appears in Best American Short Stories, The Cut, McSweeney's Quarterly, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. She is a National Book Foundation 535 honoree. Karen Chee is a comedian and writer for Late Night with Seth Meyers. She has also written for the Golden Globes, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, and she is currently working on a humor collection for Holt, which we are all very excited to read. Welcome, everyone. Again, thank you so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Pam.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to my paperback event. I mean, I know it's just like a hard time and for the Asian American community, and I really appreciate your taking the time out of today. Hopefully it feels even digitally like we're all together in some kind of room. At least these digital events have been giving me that kind of solace recently. So I'm just gonna start by reading a little bit from my novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold? And all you need to know about the book is it is about two children who are the children of Chinese immigrants in a reimagined American West. It's not quite realist. There are tigers roaming this landscape as well as buffalo. At the beginning of the novel, their father died suddenly in the night, and they're just flung off on this quest to find a sense of home and belonging in this place that is hostile to them. So I'm actually going to read a little bit from the very end of the book when one of the characters, Lucy, is thinking about her connection to the land. She thinks of the other direction, the hills where she was born and the sun that bleaches sky and brightens grass. She thinks about when she stood in a dead lake and held what men desired and died for. She thinks that was nothing, really, compared to the way the noonday sun makes the grass blaze, horizon to horizon a shimmer. Who could truly grasp it? The huge and maddening glint, the ever-shifting mirage, the grass that refused to be owned or pinned, but changed with every angle of light. What that land was and to whom, death or life, good or bad, lucky or unlucky, countless lives birthed and destroyed by its terror and generosity. And wasn't that the real reason for traveling? A reason bigger than poorness and desperation and greed and fury. Didn't they know low in their bones that as long as they moved and the land unfurled, that as long as they searched, they would forever be searchers and never quite lost? There is claiming the land, which Ba wanted to do, which Sam refused. And then there is being claimed by it, the quiet way, a kind of gift in never knowing how much of these hills might be gold. Because maybe if you only went far enough, waited long enough, held enough sadness pooled in your veins, soon you might come upon a path you knew. The shapes of rocks would look like familiar faces. The trees would greet you, buds and bird song lilting up. And because this land has gouged in you, an animal's kind of claiming, senseless to words and laws. Dry grass drawing blood, a tiger's mark in a ruined leg, ticks and torn blisters, wind coarsened hair, sunburned in patterns to leave skin striped or spotted. Then, if you ran, you might hear on the wind or welling up in your own parched mouth, something like and unlike an echo, coming from before or behind, the sound of a voice you've always known calling your name. She opens her mouth. She wants. And I will end there. There you are.
Hello.
Hi, Karen. So good to digitally meet you.
It's so nice to digitally meet you too. That was beautiful. I loved your book so much. I'm really excited to get to do this talk with you. I'm gonna see if I can make you bigger. Okay, great. Now you're huge on my screen.
Oh no. I think the most unnerving event so far in book tour has been attending a writers festival in Australia where I got to see the horrifying footage of my face on like a 50-foot screen while everybody else was there in person. So
Oh no.
yeah.
That's really funny. I kind of love that. Yeah. Have you been doing a lot of these virtual events?
I think so, but it's also like, what is time, right? I barely know how many months have passed. I guess it's been a year since the hardcover came out, but yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I read your book maybe like a week into lockdown last year.
Oh wow.
Um, and I remember being like, oh, I was so grateful to have, I think I truly, once I opened it, I was like, I could not put it down until I was done. And it was like a day and a half of just my brain consumed by your book. And I was so, on the one hand, grateful that I got to be consumed by this book during that, awful time. And then at the same time afterwards, I was like, I want to be held because of the pandemic. I doubly
Oh,
want to be held because of your book.
oh.
And I was so alone. Um, but yeah, how do you feel a year out after the book has come out?
You know, I was just reflecting on it today, and I think what's really been great about these conversations I've been able to have, all the events I've been able to do, all the people that I've been able to meet, even through chats and screens, is that as a fiction writer, I feel like we often kind of weirdly enough don't like to think about our work while it's happening. We sort of like prefer not to articulate what we're trying to do. I think it can be really scary, right, to straight out say what you're trying to do. But the process of talking to people, and particularly, people from the Asian American or Asian diaspora community, or women or queer people or non-binary or trans folk, it's helped me articulate who this book is for, and it sort of made me braver in sort of declaring, like, this is the space I want to occupy for us. I've been thinking a lot about that injunctive to take up space, in light of a lot of the recent crimes in the news.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to ask a follow-up though. When you say it's scary almost to talk about your work as you're doing it, why is that? Are you worried that you're going to sound like you're being self-important about your work, or is it that you're actually going to mess up something magical that's happening?
That's a great question. I think you're very insightful because you captured both parts of it. I think one is that it is kind of scary, to be ambitious, frankly, about your work. I think especially as a person of any marginalized population in the United States, this kind of horror story I sometimes like to tell when I'm giving advice to people on how to like find agents and find readers for their work is that you have to really you have to be really careful about whose input you let into your brain, right? So my very, very first writers conference that I ever went to in my early 20s, the book was just this like floppy manuscript, and it was one of those things where you meet an agent for 10 minutes and all they've read is like a one-page synopsis of your work, right? And I go into this event, and the agent is this straight white man who, without ever having read a word of the book immediately tells me, okay, right away we have issues. You are trying to tackle too many things in this book. You can't tackle queerness and racism and misogyny and, you know, the gold rush and magical realism in one book. So if you want to sell it, you need to like rip out parts of it. Luckily, that was not my agent, and I love my agent and have never heard anything of that sort from him. But it just goes to say that there is something about a fictional project, or I guess really any artistic project in its early stages, where it's so vulnerable. And I think I was just like raised up in this way where it is hard for me to say like, I'm proud of myself, I'm going to do this thing. And sometimes it's easier for me to say like, oh, my book is like a baby and I'm going to guard it. So I'm going to go mama bear for it. Or my book is for these populations of people I've realized. And it's easier for me to sort of like take up space in defense of them sometimes than it is of myself.
Yeah, that I love that. That's such a beautiful and thorough answer. Thank you so much. I did wonder though, now that the book is out and you're talking about it with lots of people, do you like to talk about the book, or do you sort of wish the work could speak for itself and, sort of be vague in that sense?
Yeah, I think that it's hard because I think there is a lot of value in talking about the work and about the motivations, but sometimes when you actually get to like what emotions is it trying to convey, like what is the prose itself trying to do, that is something where as a writer you kind of wish that that part of the work would speak for itself, right? There's something, I think what is amazing about fiction is there is this kind of ineffable like heart of it that you can't penetrate. And I think that's part of what makes it so compelling, right? We all come to it and we see maybe slightly different things in that heart.
Yeah, that's amazing. I will say, when I first read your book, and I recently reread it to do this, and something that I forgot about how much I was struck by the first time around was kind of in what you were saying, and maybe this wasn't intentional, in which case, like, what a magical side effect, but it really felt like your prose was so atmospheric, I think, and in a way where it really felt like at times I was being bogged down by the sort of suffocating nature of things sort of like floating around in San Francisco at the time
Mm.
of the gold rush, of like the time of the ground being uprooted all around them, and it really felt like I was there and sort of in this dense area. And I thought that was so incredible. It felt like I was breathing differently in certain parts of the book, and I was just like, how did you do that? But of course, that's your writing. That's so cool. Somebody just wrote atmospheric, and now I'm worried I used that word incorrectly. But we'll move on. Nobody
No,
correct
I
me.
think they're agreeing with you. They can only
Okay,
mean that they're agreeing with you.
thank you so much. Um, well, I was researching, and I wrote a bunch of your interviews beforehand, which I was blown away by because all your answers are very eloquent, and I'm always very jealous of people who are like that in interviews because I ramble way too much. But one of the things I read that was really interesting was you said that you dreamt a sentence of this book, and that's how you wrote. What
Yeah,
was?
the first sentence, that's just how it always comes to me. I think that for me, I'm so attuned to sentences or for better or for worse. I'm so attuned to the sonic qualities of prose that those are often my entryway, much more so than, definitely more so than a plot. I really don't know how to plot things, especially in a first draft. I think that stuff kind of always feels accidental when it falls into place. Character is important, but it is like, and you mentioned, yeah, landscape. It's landscape and sound that really let me enter into a new piece of work.
That's amazing. So for everything you write, it starts off with a sentence. Is that
Yeah, some kind of voice. And maybe sometimes like that first sentence doesn't make it into the final draft, or maybe it's more like a sentence that, moves eventually towards the middle of the piece, but it is a sound.
I love that so much. I also am now wondering, because something I really admired about your book was that it felt like there were so many ways in which this book could have accidentally been preachy almost, or and it never veered into that territory. And I wonder if it's because it wasn't plotted out, or if it because you had the sentence and you came up with these characters and you thought, I'm just going to let them live out their lives. And
Yeah.
were,
Oh.
you know, queer Asian people at that time. No, go ahead. I
Oh,
was
I
just,
was no, I was just gonna say, I think that something that I found a lot of solace in. So I had a conversation earlier this year with Charles Yu, where he gave me the really great language of, he calls it the I think the -1 draft, where I used to call it the garbage draft, and my publicist was like, you can't call it the garbage draft. So now I'm taking Charles Yu's terminology, but the idea is that that very first draft, it helps you if you don't even think of it as a first draft. Like, don't even put that pressure. It's like a negative draft, it's a 0 draft, it's nothing. And I think the way there is to just, follow instinct and follow emotions and follow the characters where they go, and sort of have faith that a better later editor version of you can fix things like plot.
I love that. So when you're writing that -1 draft, are you trying to write it as quickly as possible just to get everything out onto the page, or are you trying to overwrite the book and make it too long so you have stuff to pick from?
That's interesting. No, I just try to get it out as quickly as I can. So I think in the case of this book, it was a matter of sort of weeks that first -1 draft came out. And I've just been working on another book. And similarly, I just felt like I kind of had to like not write for a period of time, let it kind of build up ahead of steam, and then let it all explode out on the page in a shorter period of time.
That's so cool. I love that. I'm a big like plotter and planner, so I'm always amazed when people don't have to rely on that. That's um I was wondering, oh, okay, here we go. I'm looking at some questions I've typed up beforehand. Um I think there are, and I was reading this in a lot of reviews of your book, but you had never brought this up yourself in an interview. And so I was wondering if this was intentional, where there were parallels in your book to As I Lay Dying in terms of Lucy and Sam carrying around Bob's body, throughout sort of the Old West kind of a vibe. And I wondered, was that intentional or did that come afterwards where you were like, oh man, this is kind of like Faulkner, but I did think of it separately on my own?
Um, so I have never read Faulkner, and I've never read
Oh,
As I Lay Dying. So, like, I'm sure I would enjoy him if I did. And so I'm always really flattered by the comparison. But at the same time, when sort of people ask me why I haven't gotten to him yet, I'm like, I mean, there are a lot of other great writers to write. Mostly right now, I'm reading women of color.
yes, Faulkner is famously not a woman of color.
Very famous for that.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. I read As I Lay Dying for my high school English class, and um, I was really struck by, I just saw the Instagram post that you made earlier today about how, in hindsight, you wrote this book for yourself as a young person. And that sort of, got me to thinking about, like, what if I read this book in place of As I Lay Dying in high
Mm,
school when I was like a young Asian girl growing up in California, and learning about the gold rush, but always learning it in a sort of way that centered the white people in it, and in a way that centered the white men in it, especially. Uh, and I wondered if you could sort of, imagine yourself going back in time and as a young person reading this book of yours, how do you think that would have changed your outlook? How do you think that would have changed you as a person?
mm.
Have you come across this without being the person who wrote it?
Oh man, that's such a great question. It just like it gave me like a tiny little stab in my heart for all of us who are reading like Faulkner and Hemingway instead of other people. So like in high school, I don't think we read any Asian American writers in my high school canon, but I distinctly remember every single non-white writer we read. And so like one really formative book for me, and in some ways formative for How Much of These Hills is Gold, is Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I think one of the reasons is I was really struck by the sort of authority she takes, right? It's a book that is also syntactically and stylistically original and in some ways difficult. And it's sort of, she said this in interviews, right? She just declared the space she was occupying as the center, and declared that for her characters. And so definitely I think reading a lot of Black writers has sort of given me some of that courage when I think about Asian Americans entering the canon in their own way. um, and I think that if I had read Asian American novels in high school, I think that I could have maybe started from a different place. What I mean by this is, like, before I worked on this novel, I had only written short stories, and all my short stories, or at least the majority of them, tend to be modern. They tend to, right, like take place in like San Francisco in 2000. Or they tend to be and they tend to have elements of speculative fiction. And when this book first came to me, I actually didn't want to work on it for a long time because I was like, oh my God, I don't want to write a book about being sad and lonely in America and about racism. But I think it really was that like younger version of me who's like, you need to deal with this, you need to talk about this, you need to tell this story, which is a real story that is happening every day first, and sort of get it out of your system. So yeah, maybe I wouldn't have had that to write this book. Maybe I would have started on book 2, which is very, very different, like the utter opposite.
No, I love that. I also feel like because you wrote this now, there's, probably some other person in high school right now who has read it and is really taking this book for granted in a beautiful way and is now, just going to leap straight to whatever happy thing is happening in the year 2000.
I hope so. Isn't that just like what we all want for progress, is to just not have to worry about hard things and have like all our descendants take everything for granted?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, 100%. I also was thinking, I think anytime I read about Asian American history or even historical fiction, whenever people are having a hard time, I'm like, man, this is the people in at that time, alive at that time, might not know it, but it's like their descendants triumphed, like
Mhm.
we're talking over Zoom, which I'm sure they would find magical.
I'm
We're talking,
drinking sparkling water that costs like $5.
yeah, it's $5 whole. You could have bought a house back then. Um, I think that's amazing. I love learning about not necessarily sad people per se in history, but whenever I do learn about that, I think, well, yeah, like there was a very good reason you came, and it's unfortunate that you didn't personally get to reap the benefits, but I hope they did, in some way or other.
Oh man,
Um,
I think about that all the time with I don't know if your parents are first generation immigrants.
yeah,
Yeah, mine are too, but just yeah, it's something that really struck me as I was working on this novel as well, this idea of like immigrant parents and how much we owe them, how much they've given us because in many cases, right? I mean, they give up one life in the country that they emigrated from. And then when they come here, they often have to start from scratch. And they know that sort of like they may never live a comfortable life. It's really about what they can pass on. It's yeah, I think about it a lot these days.
yeah, no, that it's true. It's almost sometimes it's pretty difficult to breathe thinking about that, right? It's such a great, but I actually in case there's anybody watching who's also, a kid of immigrants, I was talking with my parents about this recently. Somewhat recently. I have no concept of time. This is probably last fall. um, but I was telling them like I can't imagine doing something like that for someone I've never met before. Because in my case, I was born in the U.S., so there was no physical person that they were doing this for. It was just this idea of, their children. And something my mom said that made me feel so much better is that she was like, well, it was for the idea of our kids, it was for the idea of our family, but she was like, it was also very selfish. In terms of if she was like, if I had this opportunity to go to the US and to do this for my family and I didn't do it, she was like, I would be more uncomfortable living, in Korea and wondering what would have happened if I had done that. And she was saying it was not, the burden should not be falling entirely on you. It was selfish, and it was selfish in a triumphant way, I think, not in a
Yeah.
negative, but in a
No,
way that was very liberating for me to hear also.
yeah, that I think that resonates me. The other thing is like I recently had a family trip back to China where, I think the other thing about our parents is it's really hard for us to see them as human beings when we live with them because they're like only somebody in relation to us. But, I always thought of my mom in like one specific way, kind of like, like dull and always like nagging on me, whatever. I'm sorry, mom. But when I went back and visited relatives in China, suddenly they're like, oh yeah, your mom, she's like really headstrong and stubborn. And like she wanted to go to America and nobody could stop her. And I was like, that's the other thing about our parents is like, yes, I agree. We should like, we owe them something, but also it's dehumanizing to think that they weren't also just like in search of something cool, in search of adventure, in search of like a thrill too, right?
No, that's 100% true. This is kind of also, sorry we're on a tangent, but I remember reading in Ali Wong's book, Dear Girls, there was a moment that like so resonated with me that I always really appreciate reading stuff, especially by other Asian American women, because there are moments in my life where I'm like, oh, I think this is just, that happened just to me, like I'm an anomaly. And then I realize I'm like part of a bigger culture that experiences it. But she said something similar to what you're saying, where when she went back to, or when she went to Vietnam, she saw her mother become this like hilarious, gregarious person, whereas in the US she was, you know, a much quieter human. And I was excited by that because that happens to my mom every time we're in Korea, where I'm like, oh, you're the funny one. You're the funniest person in the room here.
And that's where
Um,
you got it from, maybe.
yeah, I think so. She's much funnier than I am. She does like accents and everything. Um, but okay, cool, cool, cool. So I'm gonna go back to your book. Kind of, oh, actually, kind of what we were going off of before. In terms of things that inspired you, were there things that you realized after you had written the book where you were like, oh, I did draw inspiration from that? And it maybe was in a book or literature of any kind, but maybe like a song or like a photograph that you had seen from, I don't know, like the 1800s, maybe?
That is a good question. So two maybe inspirations is I did go back and don't ask why. It was vaguely supposed to be research, but I read the entire Little House on the Prairie series, like all 7 or 9 books all over again. And I was like, oh my God, so much of what I do in this book is pulled from that idea, the sort of like a retwisting or like a retelling. Like there are two siblings, they're in opposition, there's this family traveling again across the landscape. And I think that something I was really interested in that always bothered me actually about the Little House series, right, was this, it has such this strong idea of manifest destiny and of like getting your own little plot of land and then keeping tabs on it. I remember even as a young child, before I was aware of anything, there's like this one very strange scene where the family like builds this beautiful house in Indian territory, and then later the government tells them they need to leave because I mean it's Indian territory, it's not theirs. But in the book you're supposed to be allied, right, with the white family settlers, and it's like really sad that they've given up this like beautiful garden and this wonderful log cabin that's been built. And I think some of those like some of that uneasiness about those questions of like claiming land sort of turn up in different ways in my novel.
Yeah, that's actually really beautiful. I've never thought about those two in juxtaposition, but it is, my gut reaction is it's really cool how I think in kind of oppositely in Little House, right? Pa is the person who's like wants to keep moving, if I remember correctly, which is kind of it's really, it feels weird that he every you know few years he like uproots the family and moves them to a brand new place and they have to start all over again each time. Um, and he sort of feels power over each place that he moves to in the way that the characters in your book are moving because they don't feel power in each place that they're in. Um, but it's really powerful, I think, the act of moving and the act of deciding to try again and go elsewhere. Um, Man, I love your book.
Oh,
I was wondering, I have this sort of outline of a question that I haven't really been able to flesh out, but kind of similar to the idea of Pa, I guess, versus Ba. Um, I think a lot of the sort of images we've seen of America during the gold rush and of the Old West are centered around really like tall, broad-shouldered, handsome white men, right? It's like a white man's idea of the platonic ideal of a white man as imagined by a white person. And this book almost has the complete opposite character as characters as their protagonists, both of them. Um, and I was wondering, like, how much of that how much of what were you thinking about of the literature that was already out there and the movies that were already out there? Were you thinking about this book um, sort of changing the narrative in that sense, or were you solely thinking about it in the world of your characters, and then afterwards being like, "Oh, how nice that I've also sort of taken down, the Western canon in this way."
it's basically it's like fun to fuck around with it. And that was actually one of my ways into the book. So I think like Sam was a character who sort of appeared fully present from the moment they entered the scene. And like one Sam in the book is one of the characters who looks up to that sort of mythologized ideal of the white swaggering cowboy. And Sam twists that for their own purposes, right? Decides to adopt this swagger, adopt this walk, and just like reclaim that. And that was so fun for me to do. And I also took a lot of inspiration from the sound of those westerns, the dialogue that's written in this kind of cowboy poetry that's really slangy and twangy. And I thought it was really cool. And I mixed that with Pidgin Mandarin. I wanted to have that kind of like choppiness and that kind of gait to the sounds in my book.
That's amazing. I love the way you just said that you like to fuck around in that. That's really cool. And I wonder, were there, in the same way that you were sort of excited to fuck around in a lot of these almost untouchable landscapes, or seemingly had been untouchable before in my mind, were there certain things that you thought, I have to respect this, I have to not touch this, or things that you want to sort of not mess around with?
Hmm. I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of my book a little bit is that it's a book also deeply concerned with climate change and environmental devastation, which we think of, as modern day topics, but are like so ancient. I think part of the story of the American Wild West is the story of people destroying a land and, ruining its water, killing its buffalo, etc. And yeah, so from that perspective, I was really interested in keeping that kind of damage to the land and the human toll on the land really realistic, for lack of a better word, really gritty. Like I sort of like didn't want to apply to that any kind of like magical or mystical filter. It was really important to me to record how much the human beings in this book are changing the land to catastrophic effect.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Were there things kind of going off of that, and also I saw you touch on this, and I can't remember which interview it was, but you were talking about how like in Parasite, for example, there were lots of extra details, that the director had thought of and written, but that didn't make it into the movie, but still get captured into the atmosphere of the movie because they were so fleshed out. Were there things in the novel that you were so excited to have brainstormed or thought up that didn't make it into the actual final draft?
First of all, we could talk about Parasite for like another 10 hours. But I will refrain. Yeah, there were. I think that one of the most valuable things I ever got while working on this book was advice from my editor very early on in the process, where, again, I write those -1 drafts. I write really quickly. Things often don't make sense. And she told me when I was editing that she gave me like a huge, like, I don't know, like 5-10 pages of questions. And she was like, you don't have to put the answers to all these questions in your book. Actually, you shouldn't, because that would make the book impossible. But
Yeah.
but as the writer, you should know the answer to all these questions. And they were things like, literally, how many miles did Lucy and Sam travel on this date? Like, what food were they eating? How did they carry it? Right? Is it realistic to this time period that there should be like flint or a lighter or whatever? And so there are lots and lots of those details that keep the book honest, most of which never went in. But as far as things that I threw away, there are just too many to list. Like entire characters have been killed, destroyed, erased. So many characters, entire plot points have been destroyed. I think at some point, actually, there was a pandemic or some kind of epidemic in the book, and that got taken out. So
That's amazing. And when it comes time to cut these things, are you very ruthless about it, or do you feel really, agonized about saying goodbye to somebody?
I know I love to chop things. I love to destroy things. Like there's nothing better than like having sort of being cowardly, working on something that isn't quite working, and being like, it's gross, but I guess it's here, and then just being able to take that all out later. I love it. Everyone should always start with a blank document when they draft.
That's fantastic. That's such great advice too. I really like that. Yeah, whenever I have to like cut something that I've worked really hard on, I always just imagine somebody on the internet hating it, and then I'm like, oh, thank God. I'm not gonna get bullied for this.
Okay, that's a tool for my toolbox. Going to think about that.
um, a question that I had before was if because you know how after I read like a really good book, it sort of lives on in my head afterwards. And the best case scenario for a book is it sort of reorients my worldview a little bit, and then I get to sort of carry that with me forever, even after I've sort of forgotten what the plot was or who the characters' names are and things like that. And in your mind, what would be the dream situation for the reader to take away from your book or to carry with them afterwards?
Hmm. I think one is just, I mean, this image. I'm such a visual person, and the book was such a visual book when I was imagining it. Just like this image of, I mean, frankly, of Chinese Americans
Yeah.
in the West in this time period. I think like people are often just like shocked by the very premise of the book when, you know, one of the pieces of sort of factual history that I incorporated in the book is at near the end, there is this railroad spanning the United States that is completed, which did indeed happen in real life. And in real life, boatloads of Chinese laborers were brought over, and they did a lot of the final work on the railroad in the West. And it was like hard, brutal labor. But when they took a photograph to commemorate, you know, joining the East in the Western lines, you look at the photograph and there are zero Chinese faces. Like I remember actually being like so astounded that I had zoomed into this blurry photo from Google and like looked over every single face. They posed it with all white people. And you know, I think that it's often, I feel like we've often fallen into this false trap in modern times of saying like, now we're talking about racism, now we're talking about trans people, right now we're talking about the Me Too movement, misogyny, and we forget that these things have been happening. They've been part of human society for like hundreds and thousands of years. Like queer people have always existed. There were Chinese and Black and Latinx people in the American West, but it's really this very whitewashed history that's been passed down to us. Recorded history is not necessarily a trustworthy history, especially not in a country that is like built foundationally on white supremacy, right? Where the history books were written by and for white men. So I think just that image, just that knowledge, and I hope that image is as endearing as an image of, you know, Clint Eastwood walking down a street at high noon.
It is really, it's really endearing, and it is also really there's something I think really grounding in learning the sort of cold hard facts of Asian American
Mm,
history, of being like there were Asian people, you know, in California at the time, there were Chinese laborers, you know, alive and working, and, you know, like falling in love and having children, you know, and
yeah.
at that something about that just being a fact and getting to imagine it in fiction is so yeah, it's really grounding to think about, almost more so than thinking about Asian people now, I think, right? Because I think now it's sort of like, yeah, I can see my friends, I can see my family, but something about it happening back then, it's like, oh yeah, we've been in history, like we're woven into the fabric of this
Yeah,
country.
it's really important. I mean, I know it's become like kind of like a cliche now, but representation does matter for exactly that reason.
Yeah, that's true. And I will say, I think something that I loved about your book too was that it felt like representation where representation wasn't the end goal of the book. It felt like you were trying to tell the story honestly, and to tell it honestly, you had to create these characters and represent them as fully dimensionally as possible. And I think because of that, it felt really real. You know, I think there were moments where even like maybe the magical realism sort of went over my head, because I was like, this is a real thing that happened. Like I'm seeing.
Yeah, I've had people, oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, I've had people ask me, were there tigers in the American West?
Yeah,
And it's like,
truly. It's like I believed it. There were buffalo everywhere. Like this makes sense to me. But yeah, that's super cool. I think I have gotten a time notice. Let me just make sure I'm not going over the time. If I have, feel free to have somebody yell it out. Oh, 7 minutes Q&A. Great. Um, okay. Oh, well, so now this is more about the actual writing part of the book, and not as much about the book itself. But I was wondering, when you said this is it's your debut novel, and before that you had been writing short stories. Had you been dreaming of writing a novel for a long time? And at what point did you realize, like, oh man, I'm doing it. Like this is actually happening.
so I have a drawer novel that I wrote before this one, like way, way too early in my life. That's just like so terrible. It's never going to see the light of day. And then I like took a break from writing fiction and then sort of resumed with short stories. And you know, the thing was like right before I started this book, I love, first of all, I love short stories. Short stories are amazing, and they're kind of the perfect thing to read right now during the pandemic because they're just like magical. They have these like this kind of like fast magic. Anyway, so I really was really in the groove of writing short stories. I enjoy them. And this started out as a short story. So the first chapter, with very few changes, was a standalone short story that I published. And I thought I was done with it then, but these characters just kind of kept haunting me. They kept popping back in my mind and sort of like wondering what they were going to do next. So I really didn't want to write a novel because, as any novelist will tell you, it's a grueling haul. It takes so many years out of your life, and I resisted it for a really, really long time while these characters kept rattling around in my brain space. And then I caved after maybe like half a year. It worked on this.
That's amazing. I'm so glad you caved. What a great job. When you keep talking about how this book it was very visual for you and how you're a visual person, are you at all interested in, trying to write this book as a movie, or do you feel like it works best as a novel where people imagine the visuals?
I do think that it would be very cool to see it on screen one day. I think that as a viewer and a reader, I really enjoy sort of interpretations of books rather than sort of like attempts to straight up transcribe a book into a different format. So I think that if it happens one day, I'd be really curious about that. I'd be curious to sort of like give another artist like a leeway, sort of like a way to see into something of their own through the lens of my book.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a really good way of putting it. I feel like that was also very separately. I loved Greta Gerwig's Little Women, and I think it's because she really just sort of made it into its own thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, okay. So the last question for me before we move on to questions from the audience is when you're actually going back through and editing the book, what do you find is the hardest part of it, and how did you sort of work through those obstacles for yourself?
Honestly, I think it's emotional, right? When you're editing a book, I mean, at least for me, I'm reading it from beginning to end, like time after time after time, like dozens and dozens of time. And so if you're doing a good job at all, as you reread your own work, you're sort of like reliving a lot of the emotions of these characters' lives, and it's just a lot. I mean, a lot of it has to do with two children who are traumatized, frankly. And I think that, as a reader, you can take breaks and you read it once, but as a writer, I'm just like, it gets grueling. Also, the fact that because I'm so obsessed with the sound of the book, I forced myself to read the entire manuscript out loud, recorded myself doing it, and then listened to my recording of myself sped up. Anyway, so that's also just like physically grueling.
Yeah, did you lose your voice at any point over your book?
Oh no, thank God not.
Okay, I was gonna say that would have been such a sad metaphor to lose your voice.
It really would have been.
Yeah, it's like the wrong takeaway from Little Mermaid. Um, okay, cool. It looks like we have a ton of questions from people for you, and I want to make sure you get to answer them. Um, okay, cool. I'm gonna sort of is it okay if I just sort of read through them really quick? I'll read them aloud to you and you can answer.
Oh, sure. Let's do it that
Okay,
way.
cool. This question is from Jules. The question is, your book was wonderful. I loved it so much. Which character was easiest to write for you, and which character was the biggest challenge to write?
Hmm. Oh man, these are such good questions. How are you all so much better at this than professional interviewers? So I think probably the character that was easiest for me to write, unsurprisingly, was Lucy, who for most of the book is like the eyes of the book. And I think that's I see a lot of myself as a young girl in Lucy. As a character, one of the themes that was like really, really important for me to explore, and I think is like coming up in a lot of conversations today, is this question of model minorityhood and this like desire of Asian Americans specifically to assimilate into whiteness and like lose themselves. And Lucy is someone who really buys into that for a lot of the book, and I was someone who bought into that for like a good chunk of my life. And so it's something I've sort of like obsessed over. And as I've educated myself and sort of gotten over that in myself, like I think a lot about why I was swayed by that desire for assimilation. So Lucy was easy for me to write. And then in terms of the biggest challenge, I know it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I don't think any of the characters were really that hard for me. I think you just yeah, they felt like members of my family as I was writing them.
Oh, I love that. Were you really sad when you finished writing? Or was it like that you don't get to talking through these characters, or keep hanging out with them?
I think no, just because the ending of the book and the way I prefer endings is to leave space for interpretation and ambiguity. And so, like, for myself, I think a work of art is successful when the characters feel like they're living entire lives off the page, like, living through plots that you aren't reading about. So I don't miss them because I feel like they are there. And if I like think about them, like, I feel like if you ask me, like, to imagine like whatever Lucy at 27, like I could think about that, right? It's
Yeah.
yeah.
That's so cool. Okay, the next question is from someone named Amanda, and it is: are there aspects of the story that you do need to plan? Do you have any tips to still create a cohesive plot or storyline?
Hmm. I tried a bunch of things. I think when I was drafting, there are a couple of times I would write out outlines, just like bullet points of like this happens and this happens and this person goes here. And then I would try to follow them on the next draft, but then I would inevitably deviate like less than a quarter of the way through. But that doesn't mean that that didn't help. I think, yeah, I think the most important thing for me is always just getting into the character's mind and just trying to embody them and think about what they would do next. And to that end, the most useful bit of craft advice I ever got was from this writer named Laura Vandenberg, who said, when you get stuck on a plot point or in any piece of your writing, sit down and make yourself write a list of like 50 to 75 things that might happen next. And the important part of this exercise is to get to that number, because what you'll find is like the first like 10, 25, 30 things are things that were like really obvious, stupid, cheesy things. And then as you sort of force yourself to like break through that wall, you start coming out with like pulling out weird stuff from like the depths of your subconscious, right? And it often is the case that something in that list of 50 or 75 is the thing you've like kind of unlocked from yourself.
That's amazing. That's also advice I've gotten for joke writing. So that's really
Hmm.
cool. Yeah. I wonder if that's true across a lot of creative things. Okay,
Probably.
so I'm picking out answers that AW has put to answer this question live. Okay, so this next one is from Felicia. It says, I so loved the language in this book. I wanted to ask how you generally approach the sentence. If you intentionally try to experiment, or if you run with whatever language comes to you by way of character or time period. Essentially, I'm wondering how intentional you were about the style of the writing in this book. Thank you. That's so nice. They said thank you.
Oh, thank you, Felicia. So as I said, for me, the sonnet quality comes first. And so it kind of like set probably, I would say like maybe like 80% of the style. The rest of it, yeah, I did like take inspiration from reading sort of like more historical documents. I think some of those words are really fun. Those anachronisms are really fun. And then I think the other thing that was really a cornerstone of the style in this book was the fact that there's a character, Sam, who I didn't want to use gendered pronouns for at least like about the first half chapter of the book, because I wanted them to have a chance to present themselves first without the narrator in the gaze of the book gendering them. So that actually was a really conscious decision I made that changed the prose a lot. It ended up making the prose kind of like strange and choppy at times and like really sharp in a way that suited the world that I was trying to create.
That's so cool. That's also such a lovely answer. Okay. The next question is from Matthew and says, I read 5 questions for the Snake Charmer in ASF and it really changed my idea of the story. Thank you.
Oh,
Um, and wants to know, who are some of your short story influences?
love this question. Amy Hempel was like one of the first people to write short stories. It just like broke my brain. She's like a stone cold genius. So the dispiriting part of the story is the very first short story she ever wrote is this one called In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson is Buried. And unfortunately, it is the perfect short story. um, so I really love Amy Hempel. I love Angela Carter's short story collection, The Bloody Chamber. It's sort of like weird, bloody, feminist fairy tale retellings. I also want to mention a bunch of short stories I've been reading just this year. There's this new collection called Milk Blood Heat by Dantil W. Moniz. It's like Black and brown women and girls in Florida, and it's lush and beautiful. There's this book called Likes by Sarah Shinlian Bynum, and it's kind of just like this, it's just like magic. It's like one of the most magic short story collections I've read. And then, sorry, you got me talking about short stories
No,
so
I
much.
love this. People want this.
Okay, the last one I will say is there's this collection called Land of Big Numbers by Chen. And she was for a long time the China correspondent, I think, for the Wall Street Journal. So a lot of the stories take place in China, some of them take place in the US and Europe, but it's just like, it's like exuberant, and it's also really funny. So
Yeah.
a bunch of
That's so cool.
recommendations.
No, I love it. I always one of my favorite things is asking people who I think are already, sort of at the top of the game, being like, who are you really big fans of? And then it's really nice to remember we're all doing this because we're, huge fans of this medium and of this art form, and of the other people who've done this before us.
Yes.
It's so nice. Okay, this next question is from Jenny, and it is, how do you approach research for your writing? At what point do you feel like you've done enough and are ready to write with confidence? I find myself anxiously over-researching everything I write because of the fear of getting something wrong when it comes to place, time, characters, everything, especially as a minority writer. Thanks so much for this amazing event. People are so polite. I love that.
Asian American Writers Workshop is just the best.
Yeah.
Really is. I love this question. It's funny. I was just talking to a writer friend of mine last night about this. So I guess I'll start out by saying, like, think about what the role of fiction is, if you are indeed writing fiction, as it sounds like you are, what the role of fiction is versus a history textbook, versus what is the role of a fiction writer versus a historian. And so I think that when I was working on this book, I did do research in phases, but it was also really important to me to have distinct drafts where because I had a foundational knowledge of the California gold rush and the presence of Chinese miners, it was really important to me to let my imagination roam free and sort of let historical research kind of like correct or guide that after I followed those instincts. And it became sort of like a political act, an act of defiance, because the other thing is, you heard me say this earlier, but what is history anyways, right? I think we often, when we're growing up, think history equals facts, but history is just a narrative that's put in a book by a certain set of people with a certain set of intentions. And so there's like this shadow history that runs under recorded history of marginalized people, of like women, of queer people, of poor people, indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. And it's like I said earlier, people, like queer people have existed, immigrants have existed, even if they're not in those photographs and not in those books. And so one of the roles of the fiction writer, as opposed to the historian, is to use your craft and use your empathy to imagine into those spaces of erasure, those stories that maybe no longer can be turned up by an actual historian. And then, all the details, like, yes, it's important to use sensitivity readers, if it's important, especially if you're touching a culture that you don't know, to do your research. But I think it is also important to use your imagination as a fiction writer.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I also love the way you said, it's like a shadow history, which I think is such a great way of capturing it too, because something I think is very frustrating is when people say that the history of minorities in America is something that, we're missing from the current narrative. And I always want to say, like, it's not something that fits into a narrative that already exists. It's like its own thing, and you sort of have to reject the premise of that. And a shadow history is a really great way of putting it. That's beautiful.
Now, I also don't like missing there, because I feel so passive. It's like, oh, it's missing, it's nobody's fault. When it's like, wait, who tried to keep it out? Like, come on.
Right. It was, yeah, that's true. It also sometimes makes me feel like there are, I don't know, I always, sometimes I'm like, I guess, a lot of the history we have is also probably inaccurate, and there are definitely ways we can prove some things to be true, but a lot of it is probably sort of had been passed down incorrectly, and I bet that affects the other research that we're doing. Okay, cool. This is a question from Kristen. You've spoken a bit about the way your book responds to white literature, like Little House. Are there any Asian or Asian American sources that your book responds to or takes inspiration from? It says thank you, and also says I adore your book, and I'm writing my undergraduate thesis on it. That's so cool.
God, that's amazing! Like, I'm such a geek. That's my favorite kind of thing to hear. Thank you. I highly recommend this short story collection called Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen by Marilyn Chen, who I think mostly writes poetry. And I think it's her first and maybe her only book of prose, which just makes it even more incredible. But it's just this, the first word that comes to mind, it's raunchy. It's this like raunchy, irreverent, like sonically playful, just like really fun and vibrant collection where each story kind of revolves around one of a pair of Chinese American girls, and she's just like eviscerating sort of stereotypes of Asian women. And these girls like take bloody revenge on their like white boyfriends, and she plays around with all the sexualized like fucked up tropes of Asian women and makes them her own. And she just completely like tears these stereotypes up and like makes her own coat of myth around them. And it's incredible. I highly recommend everyone read it.
That sounds amazing. I feel like we have to put together like a reading list after this of all the things you mentioned. Okay, cool. So Lily is telling me we have time for two more questions. So this question is from Scott, and they ask, "What is your favorite Cowboy Wild West book that you love to hate or love despite its problems?" In a random comment, I see your book as part of a power trio with the movie First Cow and Mitski's Be the Cowboy album, and maybe Bruce Yonemoto's NSCW project of imagined portraits of AAPIs in Civil War attire.
Wow. I'm sorry, I forgot the question because I was just like trying to remember all those things.
No, that's okay. The question was, what is your favorite Cowboy or Wild West book that you love to hate or love despite its problems?
I mean, I already talked about Little House on the Prairie, but I'm also going to say Lonesome Dove, which I just straight up love. And actually, I still love Little House on the Prairie. I think it's just important to, put it in context and put it and just like question it, not just sort of like swallow it down, which I hope we're not doing with any great literature. But Lonesome Dove is amazing. It's like so emotional. It's so epic and sweepy. And I think the other thing I want to think about is like, it's not necessarily that I want to replace all of what's in the canon of the American West. I think it's just more like the canon often needs to expand. And there are like great books of literature that do center white men, but they can't be the only ones that we read.
That's a great answer. This next question is from Hannah. I would love to hear about Pam's approach to essays. How does she approach nonfiction as opposed to fiction?
Oh, nonfiction just makes me scared, man. I mean, that's why I can't be like a professional, a full-time essayist. It's hard. Nonfiction, I think often for me so far like comes from like a place of trauma where I can't like stop turning over a question in my brain, and then I just like have to write it to work it out. But it's really hard, and it takes me a really long time in my life, I think, to be able to write about something that happened to me like many, many years. I'm sorry, that's not useful advice, Hannah.
I think that's great. I think the idea of having a question that sort of doesn't leave your brain is really good. And I love that that was also sort of the impetus for you writing this novel too, where the character sort of kept lingering in your brain. You were like, I guess I have to deal with you now. That's
Yeah.
sort of how I approach doing my chores. I think those are all the questions. Is that true? Did I miss any? There's one more. Actually, this is one that AW didn't flag, but I really like is where did you build the techniques to write your novel? And this is from Amanda, who I think we answered a question from earlier too. Do you recommend any like classes or college majors or experiences? I guess I'm kind of going to broaden that question to ask, were there things that you felt were formative experiences in shaping the way that you think creatively and the way you make stuff,
I
essentially?
think honestly, just reading, right? Like reading really, really voraciously. And I think especially reading across genres, reading poetry, like nothing teaches me more than poetry, but also like as a kid and still now I read like fantasy and sci-fi and YA. I think that if you only read very narrowly, you're only going to be able to replicate those specific things you read. And that's not like great for your practice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I love that answer. I think that's so
Yeah.
nice.
And sorry, I will say I have a feeling maybe this is like a question behind the question is so there are a lot of like really great workshops and scholarships, like Tin House is a really great workshop series that has scholarships, and I did go to an MFA program. And I think the important thing to remember is those places can be really, really helpful, especially if you're not paying for them. don't pay for an MFA, especially if you're not paying for them, and they just sort of give you the gift of time. But I will say that for a long time, I felt like I couldn't give myself permission to consider myself seriously as a writer until I gained institutional accreditation, which is just not true. I think the most important thing to remember is no one is ever going to take you as seriously as you take yourself. You need to take yourself really seriously as a reader, as a writer, and you don't need an MFA. You just need maybe like one good reader. They don't even have to be a writer themselves that you trust, and you need to read and work on your craft. But you can do it. You don't have to wait for somebody else's permission.
That's such a wonderful way to end this. I love that. Thank you.
Thank you both. I love that advice so much to end on. I know there are writers in the audience. Our community is made up of writers, so that feels like a perfect stopping point. I want to call for a round of sort of virtual applause in the chat on Zoom and on YouTube. And I have just a couple of very quick closing notes and thank yous. Karen and Pam, thank you both so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and we're so grateful for your joining us. I want to thank our incredible interpreters, Chris and Christine from Pro Bono ASL, who've been helping us make this event accessible. Our friends at Books Are Magic, who are our sort of virtual booksellers for this season. You can order paperback copies of Pam's book at Books Are Magic, and we really hope that you do. It is so special. I just wanted to note as well that this Thursday, April 8th, we've partnered with the incredible poet Tina Chang to present a marathon reading with over 40 incredible Asian American women writers, including Pam, who will read and kind of create for us a really beautiful space of solidarity and comfort as we mourn and kind of come together in community. It will be really beautiful. I've seen portions of it is incredibly special, and I really hope you can join us at that event. Again, that is this Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern. You can RSVP on aaww.org/events. Maxine Han Kingston, Marilyn Chen, so many incredible poets and writers will be there. So we hope you'll join us. Finally, just very quickly, this event was recorded. It will be available shortly on our YouTube channel and on our podcast, AAWW Radio. And what we're going to do now is leave the Zoom open for about 5 or 10 minutes so people can scroll up through the chat, collect all of those book recommendations, and talk with each other. So thank you all again for joining us online. Thank you, Karen, for guiding us through such an incredible conversation. And thank you, Pam, for being here and for writing this book. This is such an incredibly beautiful and special book, and we're really glad to be celebrating it tonight. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night.
Bye.